For more exclusive content from CNBC Crypto Trader, hit the subscribe button now.
Crypto Trader is proudly brought to you by eToro. Discover a simpler way to trade and invest in cryptocurrencies and more.
Ren, if there's an iconic image of the international monetary system, it's right here. And 75 years to the day that the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement was signed, the team at Bancor has brought 250 delegates from all over the world, from a myriad of disciplines, not to remake or replace that image, but perhaps to enhance it, to redetermine what value is, and certainly to see if crypto and blockchain can be used as a means to make it more inclusionary. Here's a look at Bretton Woods 75.
Think back 75 years ago. This idyllic setting, entrenched among the granite-laden White Mountains, designed this monetary system as we know it. And on its 75th anniversary, Bancor, the cryptocurrency conversion protocol, hosted attendees in the exact same place. Voices you'd expect to hear from and be surprised by.
Former Treasury secretaries,
I want to say some cautionary things.
Fed members,
Of course, we had the global financial crisis.
World Bank and IMF officials,
How do we build economies that are more equitable?
economists,
There is financial warfare.
NGOers,
Whatever we have now isn't really working.
activists,
This memory has been carried on for generation after generation after generation.
Things like the World Bank, IMF, NGOs have done a lot of good. There are other people who would disagree.
There were writers,
Join me in looking at our society and our economy as they can be.
And we need that now more than ever.
even former military leaders,
Aristotle, Galileo, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, each was unique and ahead of their time.
and of course, leaders in the blockchain and crypto space to reflect upon and rethink economies of the future.
75 years ago, 700 men gathered here to design a framework for global economic cooperation that they hoped would end world wars. In an era so deeply etched with our worst, this gathering was intended to be our best.
Let's rewind and go back in time to some darker days in 1944. A year before World War II ended, those delegates established the post-war monetary system right here, formalizing the gold standard, the US dollar as the global reserve currency, and founding the World Bank, IMF, and WTO.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference.
So let's roll back for a moment, okay? So why did Bretton Woods even happen?
FDR actually had absolutely no interest in international monetary coordination, but this one man, Harry Dexter White, believed that the political strife that was developing in the world fundamentally had economic cause. In particular, the so-called currency and trade wars of the early 1930s. This was leading the path to war, and so we needed a new set of institutions and mechanisms to promote international cooperation and prevent its breakdown.
One of the fundamental assumptions, it seems like, of Bretton Woods 1944 was that trade between nations was the path to ensure the end of world wars. Nations that are trading with each other or even economically reliant on each other would have much less conflict between them.
That's the key. Economic cooperation and interdependence create peace. And that's the historical backdrop to realize the significance of this place. Just part of the reason why the team at Bancor spent the last year organizing and curating this very unique, forward-thinking, yet historically observant conference on the 75th anniversary.
So we're in the Gold Room here at Bretton Woods, and it's where the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed. Brock, how's it feel to be here?
Well, honored, privileged, I mean, historic. And to be able to have a conversation about the future of the monetary system 75 years later in this same space and to sit at this table, how lucky are we?
What is the historical significance of Bretton Woods?
Well, Bretton Woods laid the foundations for a stable monetary system which worked globally. And through this we had a good coordination of exchange rates. I think Bretton Woods was a basic foundation for stable, good relationships between the major economic nations over the last 75 years.
So it's a commemoration of the anniversary of the original Bretton Woods in 1944, but it is an attempt in some way to create the atmosphere of thinking about the future of the international monetary system, what it might look like in the not distant future or in further down the road with a much more diverse group. And when I say diverse, I put the emphasis on cognitive diversity. There's certainly cultural and generational diversity, but I value cognitive diversity, people thinking about things different ways.
To be here at Bretton Woods is really an amazing experience, to really feel the history that comes alive in this space and in this building.
The 75-year anniversary marks a lot of really special things, and gender equality has been a very big topic as well. There are at least 50% women here.
But here we are 75 years later, sitting in the same room that agreement was made, with a gathering of people that have, I think, some different intentions.
Anniversaries are very significant. There's something unique and special about the fact that 75 years ago, exactly to this day, this gathering took place in this place that allows us to really harness some collective brain power and energy around the 75th anniversary.
To be discussed are plans for the stabilization of world currencies. All agreements must be ratified by the governing bodies of the nations involved before becoming effective.
What's also interesting is that there hasn't been a straight path from that 1944 agreement to now. There is room for pivoting and economic change. First, it wasn't until 1961 that all the original policies were in place. Second, by 1971, then President Nixon withdrew the U.S. from the gold standard.
We will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system.
Then, President Reagan switched to a floating currency system in the 80s.
Then we talked about a revolution in economic thinking.
And today, we have 6 global reserve currencies.
It all happened here 75 years ago that really set up the post-war economic order, set up the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. The whole structure of international capital flows were really set by the way in which the people here decided to sign an agreement for setting up these kind of institutions. There are alternatives that they could have picked. They could have picked Bancor, which Keynes had pushed for, a one global currency. Instead, they allowed for continued national currencies and really put a privileged place for the dollar in that.
One proposal that was made here was actually called Bancor, and it was made by John Keynes. He was the British Secretary of the Treasury. He suggested a supranational currency, a new currency that would be owned by no nation. He wanted this currency to be distributed essentially to all the nations in accordance with their trade balance. He thought that this would be kind of a fair way to jumpstart the post-war economic order.
And the idea of having this currency for currencies is what we are like, that's really, really smart. That's much better than trying to create exchange pair between any two currencies. The idea of Bancor was exactly to be the supranational currency that will be able to connect between all the world's currencies and to be in the middle.
We see currency as a tool for human collaboration, and we don't see a limit on how much of this tool that we can have. The long tail is open to everyone. The vision really is that currency is becoming a tool for the quantifying, the storing, and the moving of the value between people, and it's much more dimensional, that value, than our current monetary system really allows us to account for. That proposal really inspired us.
And that in turn inspired the organizers to ask whether the current global economic order may pivot moving forward, given recessionary indicators that we've been covering over the last few weeks on the show. There are warning signs.
So there are a lot of challenges today in the international monetary system.
And we live in very interesting times.
Global trade wars are escalating. What do we think these are actually about? It's about money, it's about currency, and we can't grow ourselves out of these issues.
And there's great tensions around the US dollar today.
The Eurozone with a lot of questions of whether that's going to be able to stay together and work as one organization.
We are very much advocates of free trade and I mean, trade agreements the way we had them in the past.
I think everybody now understands that the multilateral institutions are under enormous stress. The reforms in terms of their governance are moving very, very slowly.
Obviously, we still have high inflation in a few countries, like in Argentina, like in much more extreme in Venezuela.
Inflation is rising globally. There's about 180 countries with currencies that the UN recognizes. About 60 of those have inflation rates above 5%. The target for the Fed is 2%.
The Fed is facing a lot of challenges in the U.S. Trying to get to its 2% inflation target.
So money is a belief system. It's also like a game of confidence. My biggest concern of our current monetary system is U.S. dollar right now becoming a single point of failure.
There's obviously massive debt loads that hover over most of the world's governments today.
The U.S. is accumulating more debt than it has in the past. Countries like Japan have extreme amounts of debt and are still paying very low interest rates.
Over 320% of GDP is the global debt. In the United States, the debt is $22.5 trillion. That's $68,000 per citizen. This is completely unsustainable.
And I actually wish the markets weren't so sanguine about it, because at some point, they're going to have to pay a price for that, and I'd rather see more discipline earlier on rather than something bigger down the line.
Negative interest rates, when governments are saying you have to pay us to hold your money here, that is normally a sign of bad things to come.
And if we get into a situation in which negative interest rates become semi-permanent, central banks are going to have to find ways of stopping people shifting into paper currency, and the best way to do that is to abolish the paper entirely and move to a digital currency in which interest rates could be sustainably and more deeply negative for extended periods of time.
It's just like with an iceberg. It's not what's above the water that sinks you. It's what's below the water. It's what you can't see that's really dangerous.
The problems and the issues that we have seem to be growing in both scale and urgency.
There's a famous line from The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway, and the American's surprised to learn that his friend went bankrupt. And he said, well, you know, Mike, how'd that happen? And his reply was, gradually and then suddenly. Meaning things that appear to be sudden actually had a build-up, and you can see the build-up, and then boom, just like that, it happens at the end. So we're still in the gradually stage, but we've gone somewhat down the road, and we're not prepared for the suddenly part.
So the question is now progress. How do we measure, and how should we measure value? Dr. Larry Summers, former Treasury Secretary under President Clinton, argued the world has seen the most positive progress over the last 75 years than at any time in history.
I think one has to say that the world has done vastly better over the last 75 years than anyone could reasonably have expected in 1944. Standards of living in rich countries have increased more rapidly over 75 years. The incidence of violent conflict has been remarkably low. And if you look at the increases in life expectancy, if you look at the changes in literacy, the changes in the role of women, it has been a spectacular 75 years.
When progress is measured strictly by economic growth, yes, but according to the writer Douglas Rushkoff, the model of never-ending growth is unsustainable.
Well, there's some great stuff in what Larry Summers said. We're in a society that, yeah, there's a lot of metrics you could point to and say, well, look at this growth, and look at this, how many people are being fed, or look at that. Say, yeah, but at the cost of the planet on which we live, the equality of our people. You know, so we just did it too long. You know, it's okay to grow economies until they reach you know, John Stuart Mill called a carrying capacity. You reach and then you form a steady state economy. But you can't grow infinitely.
being solely dependent on a system that requires eternal growth is not sustainable long term. And I'm a capitalist, but I call myself a compassionate capitalist because I think we need to embrace the fact that there will be ebbs and flows.
Certainly having economic cooperation between nations, having currencies be compatible with each other, exchangeable for each other, having international trade has brought prosperity to many people and many places, and also with it great inequality and environmental outcomes that perhaps were unanticipated and certainly now can and should be addressed.
In Brazil, that's one of the ways that's really clear is the Amazon. And we're really stuck in this low extractive value economy, and so we want to add all of the variables that today are excluded from the equation of how you value land and how you value an ecosystem, and we want to put those in the equation so that then they become monetary value and that they can actually be circulated and create a bioeconomy.
And so the models that are based on growth are especially misleading because they don't distinguish between healthy and unhealthy growth.
Addressing that discrepancy and trying to recalibrate both the measurement and value of different types of economic input for growth was Riane Eisler, renowned author and economist.
This conference is dedicated to new thinking, and oh my gosh, is that urgently needed. We must change how we measure economic health. Just think about GDP, which of course, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic, because GDP really includes activities that actually harm and take life as productive work. Not only does GDP include negatives as positives, it fails to include the huge economic value of the essential activities of the three economic sectors ignored in present thinking: the natural economy, the community volunteer economy, and the household economy, the three life-sustaining sectors that I propose in the Real Wealth of Nations must be included in our economic paradigm to meet our unprecedented challenges.
How do we then correct said discrepancies? And more pressing here that organizers asked was, how should we measure progress moving forward?
One of the themes that has been really clear here throughout this week is at what cost is our progress, and at what rate is everyone around the world globally benefiting from access to that progress.
We are living in very, very interesting times where old systems probably will not survive as they exist today. And how do we evolve? How do we make progress forward to create optimal outcomes for humanity and the planet?
What is value and what is valuable? We usually think of money as the stand-in for how valuable something is. The higher the price, the more its value. The more scarce it is, the higher its price.
I mean, the things that I care about are things about inclusion. How do we build economies that are more equitable? I care about sustainability, especially environmental sustainability. How do we give agency to people like women, minorities?
And so the concept of financial inclusion and how we at least give everyone access to the same tools so that people have, call it fairness and equal opportunity, while combined with things like transparency and trust, I think are essential to the world that we want to create going forward. And things like Bancor and their protocol to deliver, call it community currencies, I think are one of the things that if you're really interested in this aspect of how we can make the world a better place and how we can democratize the global financial system in a way where every human being on the planet has equal access, definitely one of the rabbit holes I recommend going down.
Well, my big interest is in the bottom billion, the underserved populations who aren't currently in the economy, who don't have identities, who don't have access to the economic system, who don't have access to electricity and the things that we take for granted.
I think it's really great to have these conversations because we're creating systems that needs to work for all of us. and we're really discussing what's happening in the world with inequity.
I believe that all the unbanked deserves banking facilities, credit systems for them, and they deserve modes of marketplaces and to be able to transact value.
75 years ago, the powers that be kind of architected the system, the legacy system that we're currently kind of caught up in, and architecting something new that's more inclusive and caring and hopefully better for humanity and the planet.
The current economic paradigm really doesn't account for the kinds of metrics that lead to optimal well-being.
I mean, the new hope is that we decouple the economy from an operating system that demands growth. Right? The growth-based economic operating system was devised in the late medieval period by kings who were looking for a way to stop the rise of the middle class. They were trading, they had local currencies and market currencies, they were doing fine, so they had to shut it down, and they said, all of your money systems are illegal. If you want to transact, you've got to borrow central treasury currency, from the king at interest. So the only reason the economy has to grow is to pay back moneylenders who have an artificial monopoly on transaction. For the economy to have to grow in order to support the ledger, that's the problem.
The cycle of winners and losers has to end. Whenever there are losers, everyone is losing. And the conversation here at Bretton Woods 75 really has been around how can we create win-win economic scenarios? How can one country's resources be used healthily? How can we cooperate between wealthy nations and developing nations in a way that is dignified?
So instead what we have to look at is how do we transition from an extractive, militarized, anti-human global economy to a more circulatory, regenerative economy. The way you do that is by having some small economies. You have those slowly build where they can, and there's a slow transition of an economy from a single monopoly fiat-based currency to a multiplicity of tools for different jobs.
We can create an economic system, economic rules, metrics, policies that support caring for ourselves, others, and our Mother Earth. So let's do it for ourselves, for our children, and generations to come. Thank you.
Lofty goals and heady stuff. When we come back, we'll take a hard look at whether crypto and blockchain can disrupt the status quo. Stay tuned.
So you've heard about these new cryptos that are going to explode?
Names. I'm posting your karaoke video.
You said you deleted it. Okay. There's two. Here's one.
Tired of missing out? Join eToro and start trading cryptocurrencies in no time. eToro. Sign up for free.
Buying the cryptos?
No, I'm watching you living la vida loca.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
So you've seen the history of Bretton Woods and weighed the status quo. This debate pitted mock representatives of crypto, gold, the Chinese yuan, and the status quo, or the dollar, against each other to supplant the current reserve currency system.
So let the great debate begin. The future of global reserve currencies, the sound money debate. There are other currencies besides the US dollar, the renminbi, second largest economy of the world, and will probably become the world's largest economy in the not too distant future. But of course there's gold, which some people have argued. And then of course, there's the tradition of the dollar.
First up, cryptocurrency.
For the first time in history, the sitting president of the United States of America tweeted about Bitcoin. With the introduction of advanced technologies like blockchain, the next 75 years are going to be transformed even more so than the last. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. To steal a quote from Albert Einstein, "The world needs a trustless system that cannot be manipulated by governments, bureaucrats, or corporations. So what I'm advocating for is an alternative to the system that we have today that's built on blockchain powered by crypto.
Thank you very much.
Really the purpose of the debate was to demonstrate that there is no clear winner, only diverse trade-offs.
I think the debate was excellent at getting the trade-offs, but I don't think anyone had sort of like the killer argument of why one would win versus the other. And so the default kind of goes to the status quo then.
Defending the status quo and critical of crypto was again former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers.
So I am with you on more efficient payments and transactions and the promotion of financial inclusion through institutions for storing money that may look very different from today's banks. But to suggest that those are fundamentally society realigning, it seems to me, is a case that has not yet been made.
Also here making their crypto contrarian case were Dr. Doom himself, Nouriel Roubini, and James Rickards, author of numerous books on money.
The term cryptocurrency is a misnomer because none of these cryptocurrencies starting with Bitcoin is either a unit of account or a means of payment, 5 transactions per second. The Visa system allows you to do 25,000 transactions per second. And it's not a stable store of value. The value of Bitcoin can go up 10% or down 10, 20% in a day. And on blockchain, all this blockchain enterprise DLT is bigger bullshit because they're private, they're not public, they're permissioned, they're not permissionless, they're centralized, they're not decentralized, and they're based on a trusted set of limited people who can authenticate transaction, and they're not therefore trustless. So they call them blockchain, but then none of them is blockchain.
Rickards and Roubini, however, mainly debated currency wars and the weaponized U.S. system of international sanctions. Rickards noting China, partly in response, is building its own cryptocurrency payment rail.
China and Russia are building something like that. They're not ready to roll it out because they have to get a little more gold. Russia and China developing a new cryptocurrency, you can call it a Putin coin or a Xi coin if you want to, that would be part of a permissioned distributed ledger that could be used for balance of payments and trade purposes among a set of countries that they invite in, and I expect it would be Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, North Korea, probably Venezuela, Syria, but China rather might prevail upon Hong Kong to join. Then you'd have a major financial center. Maybe they could extend an invitation to their BRICS trading partners, so get Brazil or India in the club. They could keep score in this new coin or token, and then periodically, once or twice a year, settle up on a net basis in physical gold. And China and Russia have each more than tripled their gold reserves in the last 10 years.
Gold is a hot topic. But also, back to blockchain, is Facebook's Libra that even has former Federal Reserve Governor Randy Kroszner talking about its effect.
I think at least for the next 5 to 10 years, it's sort of status quo, but something like Libra has the potential to have the technological innovation and the installed base to start to really chip away at the status quo. We'll just have to see how the regulators respond to it.
One such regulator, a European Central Bank Commissioner, was on hand right before the interest rate meeting, who is in fact open to crypto as well.
Well, there were Senate and congressional hearings just recently about Facebook's launch. What do we think?
I mean, I just come back from the G7 meeting, which was in close to Paris last week, and it was, I would say, the main topic of discussion.
The main topic?
Well, it was a very important topic of discussion. I think it's a great initiative from a technological perspective. It's great to work on cross-border payments because this is something which is underdeveloped so far. I think from our perspective it is, however, key that the products which are offered are safe. It will not be used for terrorist financing, not be used for money laundering. That consumer protection is guaranteed. If it works, we want it to function. We don't want it to be the source of a crisis.
Going back to our earlier examination, however, are we approaching an economic recessionary crisis? If so, we had wide-ranging arguments in favor of crypto and blockchain as an alternative to the current status quo.
Blockchain gives us an opportunity to democratize this tool called money in a way that we haven't had access to in the past centuries.
But there's a huge opportunity with the advent of cryptographically secure and validated distributed technology for us to really overturn things, and I think this is the natural course.
Blockchain gives us the opportunity to create a long tail of new currencies, currencies for neighborhoods, currencies for affinity groups, for teams, currencies for schools, and that's really what we focus on at Bancor.
Here you're talking about basic things like freedom of association, the ability of a group to set up some kind of a mechanism for itself and communicate value within that group. Because it's not just about communicating information, it's about communicating value. It's about transferring value.
I think now is a wonderful time for us to re-examine these questions. Blockchain is a transparent solution. It allows for any community or any currency to issue their own record-keeping system. It allows for them to track value amongst themselves and create value amongst themselves in a new way.
Where do we go from here? I'm very interested always in community currencies and how do we deliver ubiquitous financial inclusion around the planet.
And so many people who are today completely outside of the market economy can potentially participate in a market economy, because with digital technologies you can get down to the scale at which they're operating.
I think we all sense the potential for a more decentralized, distributed future that has more and more surface area for innovation rather than these kind of gated permission systems.
Right? Traditional currency worked by creating a few people who were allowed to monopolize a currency system. So anyone who wanted to transact had to borrow tokens from that central treasury and pay it back at interest. And that's what a blockchain could say, well, wait a minute, we're going to take that king, we're going to take that treasurer away.
It's because ultimately what these cryptos are doing are trying to say people want to just make exchanges amongst themselves, and they don't really need the monopoly of the government in order to facilitate that. They can find new, more efficient ways of doing it themselves.
The sentiment is that the government still is having trouble understanding that Bitcoin is still a little bit of Wild West and it's untamable. There still is a deep misunderstanding, though, of the difference between a decentralized currency and something like a Libra or a stablecoin, what is to be backed by an asset.
As more and more companies, more and more governments see this new way of building not just a currency, but a community of value, you're going to see more and more of this self-reinforcing cycle.
We are going to see much more radical transformations in our financial system than we will in the past 75 years. And I do think blockchain is going to be a key role in the future monetary system.
You start using it in effective ways, like how do we move water from being considered a commodity to being worked on as a commons? You know, that's interesting. And then blockchain is a really interesting solution for helping orchestrate and govern a commons of water or a commons of air or a commons of coal. You know, how do we economize them?
We may actually wind up seeing states embrace digital currency faster than people expected.
Yes, and so we are starting to see it in a meaningful way where we are improving the quality of lives of people that have been very, very disenfranchised for a long time. And that's what really matters from this perspective. It's about the moral high ground. You know, the problem that we suffer from as an industry more than anything else is people only hear about us in the context of the price. And it really takes away from the core philosophy of what we're attempting to do here. We are here because we see an opportunity to make the world a better place.
These meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
Bretton Woods 75 brought together a multitude of perspectives, from Treasury secretaries to central bankers.
It's a mix between economics, environmental issues, social issues, technological issues.
To crypto founders.
Our mission, as we saw it, was to present you with a diversity of perspectives.
We heard from writers.
The minute people use blockchain the way they could, which is as a way of reflecting the abundance of a society with plenty of people who have skills and want to do things, that's when it's a threat.
We heard from critics.
You cannot have scalability, decentralization, and security.
We heard from activists.
I normally say that you can never achieve anything without courage.
And crypto pioneers, even by fireside.
To say, how can we build a better system? How can we build a new monetary system at a time where, I mean, if you're not clued in, the system is clearly not going to last forever as it stands today.
And what do we take away? There are winners and losers, haves and have-nots, and negative effects of the industrial age that may be rebalanced.
We need to get outside of that old paradigm we're stuck in.
We leave Bretton Woods with that fresh perspective and new challenges facing the monetary system of the next 75 years that can reshape and reconfigure along the way.
A paradigm shift will emerge, and cryptocurrencies are most well positioned to be that paradigm shift, and in fact, they already are.
What will the next 75 years look like? Global monetary cooperation? Community-based currencies? According to many here, we are in the middle of that paradigm shift. This was the perfect historic setting to chart its course, and now could be time to set out on its path.
Crypto Trader is proudly brought to you by eToro. Discover a simpler way to trade and invest in cryptocurrencies and more.